They found him in the rain, a shadow against the grey, trembling under a streetlight, his ribs sharp beneath matted fur. The world had moved on around him, cars passing without care, umbrellas shielding eyes from his silent plea, but he stayed, frozen. It was the kind of quiet grief that fills a body and refuses to leave, the kind that whispers of lives lost and choices made too late. I remember the moment I saw him, as if it were a photograph printed on my heart. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just stared, the sheen of rain outlining every scar, every mark of hunger and despair. There was something in his eyes, something that knew more than any human could bear to understand, something waiting for a hand to reach through the wet night and find him. This story will break you, and then rebuild you. You will feel the weight of quiet moments, of small acts of courage, and of a bond that forms without words, without fanfare, and without asking permission. Like, share, and tell us where in the world you're watching from today. The rain fell harder that evening, tapping against the windshield in a steady rhythm like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. I parked at the edge of the lot, staring at him through the wet glass. He didn't move when I stepped out, didn't flinch when the cold soaked through my coat. The leash in my hand felt heavier than it had any right to. I crouched, careful, slow, letting him see that I was not a threat. The smell of wet earth, the metallic tang of his bloodied fur, the faint coppery scent of fear all crowded the senses. He lifted his head just slightly, and in that tilt I understood that he had chosen me. Or maybe in the way of quiet tragedies, we had chosen each other without knowing it. A baby cried somewhere nearby. I couldn't see him yet, but the sound pierced the wet night clear and trembling. It was tiny, fragile, and raw, an echo of everything the dog had lost and everything he could protect. I watched the way his ears twitched, the slight shift of his weight, the faint whimper that followed. He understood, even without seeing, that life still asked him to be vigilant, to watch over what was innocent, what could not protect itself. I knelt lower. His eyes followed mine, and for a long moment nothing else existed. The world had narrowed to wet asphalt, rain, and the solemn, silent understanding between a broken man and a broken dog. I whispered, though I knew he could not. Hear the words, "It's okay. You're not alone anymore." And for the first time since I had seen him, he moved not toward me, not away, but just enough to lean into the rain, as if the sky itself were comforting him. The baby's cry wavered, distant now, yet intertwined with the weight of what we both carried. I didn't reach for him. I only stayed, letting the world slow down around us, letting the moment breathe. That night, nothing else happened. No chase, no rescue, no sudden twist. Just rain, and a German shepherd who waited, and a feeling that the quietest moments are sometimes the loudest ones in memory. The rain had not stopped when I left the lot that night. My mind refused the simplicity of forgetting. Even now I can feel the cold water seeping through my sleeves, the distant hum of tires on wet asphalt, and the sharp scent of a dog who had known hunger and fear in equal measure. He stayed at the edge of my vision, a shadowed shape that refused to vanish. I didn't call his name. I didn't need to. Something in the quiet between us spoke louder than words ever could. I thought about the way his fur clung to his ribs, damp and coarse, the way his paws left shallow impressions in the mud. It was not just neglect that had brought him here. It was a story written in invisible scars, each one telling a fragment of a life I could only imagine. I thought about the way dogs remember everything, the cruelty, the warmth, the hands that carried them once and then let them fall. His memory was a map of loss. I drove home slowly, and the streets seemed emptier than they had any right to be, at that hour. Yet every shadow reminded me of him, the way he had frozen, the way he had watched, the subtle tilt of his head that held questions no human could answer. I couldn't stop thinking about what had brought him here, to this rain-soaked lot on the outskirts of a city that never paused to care. Later, when I finally closed the door behind me, and the warmth of the apartment pushed back against the chill, I tried to shake the image, but it clung stubbornly. I remembered seeing a torn collar around his neck, frayed and stained. It had once been bright, I think, red or blue, and now it sagged like the weight of a life abandoned. Every scratch, every patch of missing fur, every small limp in his gait whispered of encounters I would never witness. I found myself scanning the news the next morning, trying to locate missing dog reports. But there was nothing. No posters. No pleas, no social media posts. He was already a ghost, moving through streets that no one noticed, feeding on scraps and rainwater, surviving by instinct and memory. The thought struck me that perhaps he had been on his own for months, maybe years shaped by solitude and danger, and yet still holding on to some thread of loyalty that could not be broken. The day unfolded slowly. I could not focus. Every sound outside my window, the rumble of a bus, a distant dog barking, the soft hum of rain against the glass, pulled me back to that lot. And then, unexpectedly, I smelled it. Faint, almost imperceptible, the sharp tang of wet fur and dust, a smell that was mine now attached to him. It made my chest tighten, my hands tremble slightly. I didn't understand why, but I knew I had to see him again. I returned that evening, moving cautiously through streets that seemed transformed by memory. The city felt different at night, quieter, yet heavy with the echoes of lives passing by unnoticed. There, at the edge of the same lot, he waited. Not standing, not running, just waiting. The rain had thinned, leaving puddles and reflections that shimmered like fragile mirrors. His eyes found mine immediately, sharp and wary, yet tinged with a faint recognition. I knelt again, letting my fingers brush the surface of the water without touching him. The smell of damp fur mixed with the faint metallic tang of blood and the raw scent of rain-soaked earth. And in that small, silent moment, I began to understand something I could not yet articulate. This dog had loved, and he had lost, and he had survived every abandonment in between. I tried to imagine his earlier life. Perhaps he had once known warmth, a hand stroking his ears, the soft press of a child against his side. Maybe he had run in fields, felt the sun on his back, slept in a bed instead of under the cold night sky. But whatever love he had known had been brief, fractured, or torn away. And yet, he remained. His loyalty, his watchfulness, his quiet presence were all that remained of something greater, something human that had touched him and then left. As I sat there, rain now a gentle drizzle, my thoughts wandered to the scars along his back. They weren't just physical, they were etched into his behavior, the cautious way he shifted his weight, the way his gaze flicked toward every shadow as if expecting a threat. And yet, there was a gentleness too hidden beneath the wariness. He had learned to survive, but he had not lost the capacity for trust. Not entirely. I began leaving scraps of food at the edge of the lot. Small gestures at first, a piece of bread, a bit of meat. He did not approach immediately. He watched, calculating, weighing the risk. But gradually he began to take them, never making a sound, never letting his guard down entirely. And in that quiet exchange, I sensed the beginning of something fragile. The first acknowledgement of a connection, a tentative bridge between his world of fear and my world of care. Each night I returned. Each night, the rain or fog or chill became less important than the fact that he waited. And in the waiting I began to see traces of the life he had lived, the abandoned yard where he once might have played, the distant street corners where danger had lurked, the shadows that had once swallowed him whole. My imagination traced paths for him, guessed at the moments he had run or hidden, and felt the weight of every small cruelty he had endured. It was during one of these nights, as the mist rolled over the asphalt and streetlights glimmered through the haze, that I heard the faintest sound, a baby's whimper, soft and fragile, carried on the damp air. My chest tightened. I did not know where the sound came from, only that it had entered his awareness as well. His ears twitched, his head tilted, and for the first time I saw the smallest flicker of something that might be hope. Not hope for himself, but hope for someone else. At that moment I realized that he was waiting for more than food or shelter. He was waiting for purpose, for reason, for a chance to protect, to serve, to belong. And I too felt a pull, a quiet, unspoken urge to follow, to see where that path would lead and to witness what came next. There was no rush, no urgency beyond the rhythm of our steps, the soft sound of rain, and the fragile, imperceptible heartbeat of trust forming between a man and a dog who had known nothing but abandonment. And so we waited together night after night, rain after rain, each of us carrying our scars and memories, each of us seeking something that had been lost. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried again, softer now, as if life itself were reminding us that the world still held innocence worth protecting. And though I did not know it yet, that cry was a bridge, a subtle signal that our story was only beginning. The nights blurred together after that first encounter, each one stitched with rain, mist, and the quiet presence of a German shepherd whose eyes held stories I could only imagine. I began to notice the details that made him who he was, not just the scars or the matted fur, but the subtle movements that revealed a life of caution, a history etched into his very posture. He did not trust easily. Every step he took was measured, each glance a calculation, and yet beneath it all there was a gentleness, fragile and raw, waiting for someone to recognize it. I started leaving more than food. A blanket one evening, slightly frayed, its threads catching the faint glow of the streetlights. He approached cautiously, circling it first, sniffing it with the precision of someone who had learned to survive by memory and instinct. Eventually, he lay down on it, curling his body around the fabric as if it could hold him together. Watching him, I felt a deep ache, a recognition of all that he had endured and the solitude that had become his world. In the quiet moments, I began to imagine the life he had left behind. The torn collar, the uneven scars along his shoulders, the slight limp in one hind leg, they were all fragments of memory. Perhaps once he had known a hand that would not strike, a voice that would not shout, a home that smelled of warmth and bread and summer sun. But something had taken that away. Abandonment, accident, neglect, and he had carried the weight of it silently, like a shadow he could not shake. I thought about the streets he had traversed alone, the alleys that smelled of smoke and refuse, the abandoned lots where he had slept beneath the indifferent sky. Each scratch on his fur was a story of survival, each cautious glance a lesson learned in fear and endurance. And yet, despite it all, there was a nobility in him that could not be extinguished, a quiet dignity that clung to his ribs and spine, as if to say, I am still here, I endure, I watch. One evening, as the mist settled over the lot like a veil, I noticed a small shift in his demeanor. He did not leave when a stranger passed by. He did not flinch when a car's headlights cut through the fog. Instead, he stood, alert but composed, as if guarding something I could not yet see. I followed his gaze and realized it was the faintest sound, a baby's whimper, soft, trembling, carried through the damp night. His ears pricked, his body tensed ever so slightly, and I understood then that he was drawn not just by hunger or instinct, but by something deeper, something tethered to protection and purpose. The next day became a ritual. I would return in the late afternoon, the sky dimming to a slate gray, carrying scraps of food and fresh water. He waited, sometimes hidden in the shadows, sometimes just beyond the edge of the lot. We didn't speak. There was no need. The language between us was quiet, built from patience and observation, from the subtle acknowledgement that we were both aware of the other's fragility. And in that fragile understanding, I began to glimpse pieces of his past, not through words, but through the way he moved, the way he watched, the way he carried himself with a combination of wariness and longing. I thought often about the hands that had once touched him. Were they gentle? Were they cruel? Did he remember a child, small and warm, reaching for him with trust and curiosity? The questions haunted me because I could not answer them. His memory was locked in gestures, in scars, in silent movements that spoke of lessons learned and pains endured. And yet, he had not closed himself off entirely. The capacity for trust remained, hidden beneath layers of caution, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. Then came the first night I heard him whimper, not a sound born of fear but of longing. I had left the blanket closer to the edge of the lot that evening, and when I returned, he had circled it, lying on it for a brief moment before standing and moving toward the faint cry that echoed through the mist. I followed at a distance, careful not to startle him. The sound led us to an alleyway I had never noticed before, where the shadows clung thick and the air smelled of wet concrete and distant smoke. There, pressed against the wall, was the source of the cry. A small, abandoned bundle, wrapped in thin fabric, barely visible in the grey light. The dog approached cautiously, sniffing the edges, his body low, eyes scanning every corner for danger. I stayed back, not wanting to interfere but unable to tear my gaze away. The baby's cries softened slightly as he leaned closer, not with force but with a deliberate gentleness, as if aware that he could provide comfort without causing harm. The contrast was staggering, the fragility of the infant and the immense presence of the German shepherd, both suspended in a moment of quiet understanding that felt almost sacred. I knelt at the edge of the alley, my breath visible in the cool night air, and watched. He lowered his head, sniffed the baby's blanket, then gently pressed a paw near the infant without touching too harshly. The baby shivered, not in fear, but in recognition. And in that shiver, I saw the beginning of something extraordinary, the silent formation of trust, a bridge between lives that had known little but suffering and abandonment. Over the following days, I observed him more closely. He began to linger near the edge of the lot, eyes darting toward faint sounds of the baby's presence, ears alert, posture tense but calm. It was clear he understood something instinctive. Protection, guardianship, a quiet promise that he would stand between harm and innocence. And as he grew more comfortable, he began to allow small gestures of trust, stepping closer when I offered food, resting his head on the blanket I left, letting the misty rain wash over him without attempting to flee. It was in these moments, silent and unspoken, that I began to see the depth of his character. He was not simply a survivor. He was a sentinel, a quiet guardian shaped by loss, whose loyalty could not be earned with mere words or gestures, but only through patience and recognition of his pain and purpose. And I realized that in guiding him, in offering him patience and care, I was also beginning to confront the fractures in my own heart, the regrets and quiet grief that had accumulated over years of distance from innocence and trust. That night, as fog rolled across the lot and the world seemed to shrink into silence, I watched him settle onto the blanket. His eyes remained alert, ears flicking at distant sounds, but there was a weight lifted from him, subtle and profound. Somewhere, beyond the fog and rain and shadows, the faint cry of the baby echoed, and I understood then that our paths had not merely crossed. They had converged with purpose, each of us seeking the fragile threads of connection that life had not yet severed. I did not yet know how it would unfold. I did not yet know whether the fragile bond forming between him, the baby, and myself could withstand the world outside this misted lot. But in that quiet night, with rain-soaked fur and trembling breath, I felt the first flicker of hope, the undeniable sense that redemption, fragile and elusive, was possible even for those who had been abandoned by life itself. The days after that misty night at the lot were quieter, yet heavier with anticipation. Something had shifted in him, a subtle change that I could not name, a pull toward something I had only glimpsed. He lingered longer near the alley where the baby had cried, ears swiveling at the faintest hint of sound, body tensed but composed as if guarding not just life, but fragile possibility itself. I began to understand that he was no longer surviving merely for himself. He was waiting for a reason to endure, a purpose that had nothing to do with hunger or fear and everything to do with protection. I remember the first time I saw the baby, properly, the small bundle now wrapped in a slightly larger blanket, placed carefully against a wall by someone who had long since vanished. The child's eyes were closed, tiny fists pressed to the chest, and a soft exhalation escaped lips that had not yet learned to smile, cry, or speak, beyond the instinctual call for warmth and comfort. The German shepherd approached slowly, his movements deliberate, measured. Every muscle in his body spoke of restraint. Every twitch of his ear was a calculation. He had known abandonment, and yet here he was, unflinching before the most delicate life he had ever encountered. I stayed at a distance watching, my own pulse echoing in the damp night. There was no sound, except for the distant hum of streetlights, the rustle of leaves wet with rain, and the gentle rhythmic exhalation of the infant. The dog lowered his head, nostrils flaring slightly as he inhaled the scent of the child. There was a pause, a long, deliberate pause, and then he shifted, settling on the blanket just a few feet away. He did not touch, he did not nudge, he merely lay in the rain-soaked darkness, eyes fixed, silent, alert. It was a vigil more than anything else, a promise written in muscle and fur that he would stand watch for as long as needed. Over the following days, I returned again and again, leaving small offerings, water, food, a slightly warmer blanket. And every time he allowed the baby to remain untouched by his caution, yet he drew closer, responding instinctively to the soft sounds of breath, the tremor of tiny limbs, the faint warmth radiating through the thin fabric. It was astonishing, the way he seemed to understand that he could protect without harm, that he could watch without intrusion. I began to notice the subtle ways he adapted, shifting his position to shield the infant from the chill, moving slightly. If someone approached the alley, his eyes never leaving the bundle even for a moment. It struck me how extraordinary his patience was. He had lived a life forged in neglect, in solitude, and yet here he was, learning another form of trust, not for himself, but for someone utterly dependent. And I too was learning. Watching him, I began to see the world differently, through the lens of careful observation, through the acknowledgement that courage does not always roar, that loyalty is often quiet, and that redemption, fragile and elusive, often begins in the simplest of acts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky bled grey into navy, the baby stirred. Not a cry, not a scream, just a soft, tentative whimper. The German shepherd froze instantly, ears pricked, body taut, and I could see the shift in his recognition, instinct, responsibility. Slowly, carefully, he inched closer, placing himself just behind the blanket so that his body would form a shield if danger appeared. His eyes never left the child, and I could see in the faint glimmer of his gaze that he understood something profound. The fragile life before him needed more than survival. It needed protection, born of vigilance and care. I knelt nearby, my own hands trembling, and watched the silent exchange. The child's eyes opened briefly, unsure, and then closed again, trusting in the presence of a creature far larger and far older than itself. The dog exhaled softly, a breath I could barely hear, and shifted slightly, ensuring the blanket remained between the infant and the chill that had soaked the streets. There was no warmth beyond what the night allowed, no comfort beyond the instinctive watchfulness. And yet in that simple act, the beginnings of a bond were forming, fragile, silent, unspoken, but unbreakable in its own quiet way. I began to leave small notes of encouragement for myself, scribbled in a notebook I carried. Observe. Wait. Do not interfere. Let the connection form naturally. Each night I returned, each time the rain softened, each time the mist hung low over asphalt and brick. I watched him adapt, learned to read his subtle signals, understood the rhythm of his vigilance. He was learning too, learning that this life, fragile and small, was a life he could touch without fear, a life he could guard without expectation, a life that could anchor him to something more than the memory of neglect. There were moments, rare and delicate, when the baby's tiny hand brushed against the dog's fur, perhaps in a reflexive reach, perhaps drawn by instinct. He froze, breath caught, then exhaled slowly and allowed it, his body tensing and relaxing in one fluid motion. It was a negotiation of trust, unspoken, yet weighty with meaning. In those fleeting seconds, I saw the essence of what was happening. A German shepherd, broken by life but unbowed, learning again to love, learning to protect, learning that his loyalty could be given freely, and that redemption might still be possible. The adults in the surrounding buildings never noticed him. The city moved on, unaware of the silent drama unfolding in the shadows of streets and alleys, and perhaps that was a gift. He was free to discover, to choose, to form his bond without interference, without judgment. I felt that same freedom in observing him, the ability to witness without imposing, to be present without demanding, to allow healing to take its slow, deliberate course. Nights stretched into weeks. The weather changed subtly, rain became mist became frost, and through it all he remained constant, ever watchful, ever cautious, yet increasingly attuned to the rhythms of the baby. There was no rush, no urgency. Beyond the beat of small breaths, the faint shiver of tiny limbs, the soft exhalation of a dog who had chosen a purpose greater than survival. And I began to understand that this was what he had been waiting for all along. A reason to endure, a life to protect, a bond to form without words or expectation, a bridge to something better than solitude. And as the night deepened, the alley, shrouded in fog and silence, I realized that the story was no longer just about him or about me, it was about all three of us. The infant, unaware of the weight of history pressing upon him, the German shepherd, scarred but noble, learning to trust, and myself, silently witnessing the quiet miracle of two lives finding connection amidst the rain, the mist, and the shadows. It was slow, fragile, and breathtaking all at once. The alley had become a sanctuary of sorts, though it was far from safe, far from comfortable. The walls, slick with damp and peeling paint, held the shadows like a silent audience. The baby, tiny and fragile, slept nestled in a slightly larger blanket I had brought that night, its edges catching the dim light from a distant street lamp. The German shepherd lay beside the bundle, body low but tense, muscles coiled in silent readiness. Every twitch of an ear, every subtle shift of his weight spoke of vigilance, of a devotion born not from obligation but from instinct, a knowledge that the infant's life, so delicate and unprotected, had become his responsibility. I remained just outside the shadows, hesitant to interfere, yet unable to pull my gaze away. There was a rhythm to his watchfulness, a cadence of attention and rest that felt almost sacred. Each breath he took seemed measured, deliberate, a quiet testament to the life he had endured and the purpose he had found. I thought about the nights he had spent, alone, hungry, afraid, and the way every scar told a story of survival. Now those same scars seemed to glow faintly in the low light, not as reminders of pain, but as markers of resilience, of a being shaped to endure and to protect. As I watched, he shifted slightly, moving closer to the baby's small form. The movement was fluid, careful, ensuring that the blanket provided warmth and the slight arc of his body formed a protective shield. The baby stirred, eyelids fluttering, and the dog's head rose with subtle alertness, ears forward, eyes scanning the misted alley. There was no fear in his gaze, only the meticulous attention of one who has learned the value of life and the fragility of innocence. In that moment I realized that trust was forming, not in leaps but in delicate increments measured by shared silence, by careful proximity, by an unspoken promise that neither would abandon the other. I began to notice the small signs, almost imperceptible, the way his tail flicked slightly when the baby reached out, the subtle relaxation of his muscles as he realized no harm would come, the quiet acceptance of the warmth that radiated from the child. It was a conversation without words, a negotiation of trust conducted in gestures and glances, a delicate understanding that had taken weeks to manifest. And yet it was undeniable. The connection between them was no longer fragile, it was palpable, a silent bond that anchored both of them in a world that had offered little but uncertainty. The nights became longer, yet I found myself waiting for them as if drawn by a gravity I could not resist. I left food, water, and small comforts, a slightly warmer blanket, a scrap of bread, a bottle of fresh water, allowing him to guide the interaction, to establish the boundaries and the pace of engagement. He never rushed, never forced contact. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture measured. In his caution there was wisdom. In his restraint there was care. And I began to see that this was not merely survival, it was the first glimmer of redemption. One evening, as the fog thickened and the world seemed to shrink into muted grey, I noticed the dog lifting his head higher than usual. His ears twitched, and his gaze followed a faint, uneven rhythm, tiny footsteps, careful and deliberate, drawing closer through the alley. My heart tightened. I did not know who or what was approaching, but his body radiated alertness, his stance protective, his loyalty absolute. I watched as he positioned himself fully between the baby and the potential intruder, his eyes sharp, his posture tense yet controlled. It was the kind of silent courage that cannot be taught, that cannot be replicated, that arises only from a life tempered by loss and strengthened by instinct. The source of the noise revealed itself. A woman's shadow, slight and cautious, carrying a small bag. She paused at the entrance of the alley, glancing around, unaware of the duo within. The dog did not growl, did not bark. He simply stood, unwavering, a sentinel guarding the fragile life behind him. The woman hesitated, sensing the presence, perhaps feeling the weight of vigilance emanating from the dog, though she could not yet see him. Slowly she turned and left, moving away without incident, and the dog's body relaxed only slightly, remaining in position until the danger had fully passed. That night, I finally stepped closer, careful to avoid startling him. I placed my hand gently on his back, feeling the tense muscles under the damp, coarse fur. He did not flinch, though his gaze remained fixed on the blanket where the baby slept. I whispered softly. Words meant more for me than him. "You're not alone anymore. You don't have to fight this alone." There was no response beyond the steady exhalation of breath, but in that moment I sensed understanding. Not human understanding, perhaps, but recognition nonetheless. He knew that his vigilance had found an ally, that the world could still hold moments of safety, however fleeting, and that the bond forming here was mutual, quiet, yet profound. As the nights passed, I began to notice subtle changes in both of them. The baby, sensing the calm presence beside him, would reach out, with tiny fingers, brushing the dog's fur in a gesture both tentative and instinctive. The dog in turn would lean slightly, allowing the contact, his body radiating warmth, his breath steady, his eyes softening in recognition of the life he had chosen to protect. There were no words, no declarations, no fanfare, only the quiet unfolding of trust, of protection, of connection forged in the shadows of the alley and the muted glow of streetlights. And yet, the bond was not without its tension. Each night brought uncertainty, a passing stranger, a sudden noise, the distant echo of a city that rarely paused for innocence. The dog remained vigilant, every muscle prepared for action, every sense attuned to potential threats. The baby, however, began to settle, the soft exhalation of breath blending with the rhythmic movements of the dog beside him. In the silence, I realized that the most extraordinary acts of love often require no words, only presence, patience, and unwavering attention. In the depth of one particularly quiet night, I found myself sitting just beyond the alley's edge, notebook in hand, recording what I could, observations, patterns, subtle gestures. He shifted occasionally, glancing at me, acknowledging my presence, yet never breaking the sanctity of the space he shared with the infant. It was clear that he recognized me not as a threat, but as a quiet participant in the unfolding story, a witness to the delicate formation of a bond that had survived cruelty, abandonment, and solitude, and was now emerging in the most unexpected of places. And as the fog thickened, the distant hum of the city fading into soft grey, I realized that this was only the beginning. The trust they had formed was fragile, yes, but it was also undeniable, luminous in its quiet persistence. The German shepherd, scarred and wary, had found a purpose. The baby, fragile and unaware, had found protection, and I, silently watching, had found a reminder that redemption, patience, and the slow unfolding of trust could create something extraordinary, even in the most unlikely of places. The bond between them deepened slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first light of dawn creeping across a rain-drenched cityscape. The alley had become a sanctuary, not merely of protection, but of connection. I noticed the subtle ways the German shepherd began to shift his behavior, attuned to the infant in ways that were almost instinctual. It was not obedience to me, nor to any human command, but a self-directed awareness, a quiet transformation. Born of necessity and empathy, he began to follow the baby's patterns even when I was absent. From my perch across the lot, I would observe him pacing just beyond the child's blanket, always alert, always ready, yet never imposing. He learned the times the baby stirred, the slight movements that signaled discomfort or hunger, and the tiny breaths that carried the faintest trace of need. He was attuned, fully, and I realized that he had taken on a role that transcended mere survival. He had become a guardian, a sentinel, a quiet force in a world that had offered nothing but uncertainty. One evening, as the fog rolled low over the asphalt, he shifted closer than ever before, The baby stirred, eyes fluttering open, and his body responded immediately. He pressed a gentle side against the small form, forming a barrier against the cold night air and the distant world beyond the alley. There was no prompting, no instruction, no expectation, only instinct, tempered by the memory of hardship and the desire to protect. I could see the change in him, the careful calculation of every movement, the steady, measured breathing, the way his gaze remained soft yet alert, every fiber of his being dedicated to safeguarding this fragile life. It struck me how remarkable his transformation was. Once a creature defined by caution and wariness, shaped by neglect and hunger, he now displayed a quiet, deliberate purpose. He had found a reason to endure, to trust, and to care. Each night, as I watched, he tested the boundaries of that trust, moving closer, allowing subtle touches, permitting the child's small fingers to brush against his fur. Every contact was deliberate, a negotiation of mutual recognition, a fragile understanding that neither of them could articulate, yet both clearly comprehended. The baby, in turn, responded in the smallest, most delicate ways. A soft reach, an tentative brush of fingers along the coarse fur, the faint exhalation of breath that seemed to sync with the dog's measured inhale. The interactions were brief, subtle, almost ceremonial, yet they carried weight far beyond their simplicity. There was trust forming here, a recognition of safety, an acknowledgement that presence alone could communicate more than words ever could. I began to leave small offerings more consistently: fresh water, scraps of food, blankets layered carefully to provide warmth. He accepted these gestures with quiet dignity, never rushing, never assuming. His awareness of the child had become the central axis of his existence. It was as though he had understood the precise balance required to protect without overwhelming, to guard without smothering, to be present without intrusion. The patience he displayed was remarkable, as though the weeks of hardship had taught him that true protection required restraint as much as strength. There were moments that spoke of his past life, brief and fleeting, yet they revealed the depth of his experiences. A slight flinch at a sudden noise, a cautious glance toward a shadowed corner, the faint lift of a paw at the edge of a puddle where something unseen might be hiding. Each motion told a story of endurance, of lessons learned in hardship. And yet these same motions were now tempered by purpose, reshaped into acts of guardianship rather than mere survival. The scars he bore were no longer simply reminders of cruelty. They were marks of wisdom, evidence of a life tested and tempered, now directed toward the care of another. I began to recognize a rhythm emerging between them. The infant's movements were slow, deliberate, almost measured in the way that only babies can be. The dog adjusted to each twitch, each sigh, each small shuffle of limbs. He shifted position when necessary, his body forming a shield, yet never imposing. He seemed to understand the subtleties of discomfort and need, learning the signs that preceded fussing or distress, responding before any sound could escape the baby's lips. It was instinct refined into empathy, caution reshaped into devotion. The nights grew colder, and with each chill came evidence of his protective nature. He would curl closer, wrapping his body partially around the blanket to retain warmth. He would shift slightly if the wind picked up, or if distant footsteps echoed along the alley walls. I began to see him not as a survivor, not as a creature merely existing in the shadows, but as a being with agency, with care, with purpose. Each night's vigil was an act of quiet heroism, a slow, deliberate performance of loyalty and protection. In one particularly quiet night, the fog thick and the world narrowed to alley, streetlight, and shadow, I observed the most profound change yet. The baby stirred, reaching out instinctively, and the dog responded immediately, leaning closer, exhaling softly, adjusting the curve of his body to envelop the child with warmth. His eyes, usually scanning for threats, softened as if acknowledging that the world could wait, that in this moment there were only the two of them. I felt a lump in my throat, recognizing the enormity of what I was witnessing, the quiet emergence of trust, loyalty, and perhaps the first hints of love, born not from familiarity but from need, from survival and from choice. I began to think of him as more than a dog, more than a survivor. He was a teacher in his own way, demonstrating through patience and restraint that protection is not about aggression, but about presence, that loyalty is not about ownership, but about devotion, that connection is not about words, but about attunement to the unspoken needs of those who cannot yet voice them. And in watching him, I began to understand parts of myself I had long ignored: the capacity for quiet observation, for patience, for recognition of the subtleties of trust. Each night ended the same way: fog settling, alley dimming to grey, the baby drifting into slumber, the German shepherd lying vigilant beside the blanket, and I retreating to the edge, recording, observing, marveling. It was slow, almost painfully deliberate, this transformation, yet it was undeniable. He was no longer merely a survivor. He had become a protector, a sentinel, a quiet guardian who had discovered purpose in the act of care. And as I watched him breathe, rhythmic and steady, I realized that the bond forming here between child, dog, and observer was shaping something extraordinary. Not heroic in the way the world defines it, but extraordinary nonetheless. The silent, patient unfolding of loyalty, trust, and quiet love. The fog lingered longer that week, clinging to streets, alleys, and the forgotten corners where shadows gathered. It was in this softened, muted world that I began to notice the first signs of awareness beyond the alley walls. Neighbors passing. In the distance, unaware of the small tableau unfolding, occasionally caught glimpses of movement of an animal in the dim light, a blanket trembling as if carrying life. Yet, the German shepherd remained patient, unwavering, always alert, always vigilant. He had not only learned to protect the infant, he had begun to understand the rhythms of the surrounding world, attuning himself to its dangers and nuances with an intelligence that was almost human in its depth. I spent more time observing than approaching, allowing him the space to act, to form decisions without intrusion. It became clear that his protective instinct was no longer passive. He would rise at the first hint of disturbance, ears forward, muscles coiled but controlled, eyes scanning for threats invisible to anyone else. And yet he never overstepped. He never imposed himself beyond what was necessary. The child's comfort dictated his actions, and in this quiet obedience I saw a profound transformation, a being once shaped by neglect, now shaping his world through devotion. One evening, a soft whistle came from a distance, unfamiliar, a human presence entering the alley. The dog froze instantly, body low, gaze fixed. The baby stirred, sensing the tension, but he did not cry. The German shepherd had learned, perhaps through instinct or memory, that not every sound heralded danger. He assessed, paused, and then moved to position himself so that the infant was shielded from view. The figure approached cautiously, carrying what appeared to be a small package, and passed without incident. The dog remained still for several moments afterward, ears twitching, breathing slow, allowing the tension to dissipate before settling back beside the baby. It was in these moments that I realized the depth of his intelligence, his ability to read the environment and predict outcomes, his capacity to act with precision rather than reflex. He was no longer simply reacting, he was strategizing, prioritizing, and protecting not out of fear but out of purpose. And in observing him, I began to understand that guardianship is rarely loud or obvious. It is measured, deliberate, and nearly invisible to those who do not take the time to see. The baby's presence, once merely a point of instinctive interest, began to shape the dog's behavior in subtler ways. He would nudge the blanket closer to shelter from wind or rain, shift his body to shield the child from falling leaves or stray debris, and adjust his position according to the faintest stirrings. The infant, in turn, responded, with small movements, fingers brushing fur, a soft exhalation against his shoulder, a brief, tentative reach toward the face that had become a constant presence. The exchanges were minimal, almost imperceptible, yet they carried an emotional weight far beyond their simplicity. I began leaving my own small markers of presence, a flashlight to illuminate the area briefly, additional layers of blankets, a bottle of fresh water. He allowed them all, integrating these offerings into his protective rhythm. never letting them disrupt the bond forming between himself and the child. It was clear that he had learned to interpret my actions as supportive rather than intrusive, and in this understanding, a fragile triangle of trust began to form: dog, child, observer, all intertwined by the slow, deliberate progression of connection. One night, as the fog settled low and the world seemed muffled by silence, I noticed a subtle shift in his gaze. Across the alley, a small figure approached, not hurriedly, not aggressively, but with tentative caution. It was the infant's mother, arriving late from work, her face etched with exhaustion and worry. The dog stiffened, positioning himself fully between her and the child. Yet there was no aggression, only measured vigilance. He assessed, shifted slightly, and then lowered his stance, allowing her to approach, but only under his watchful eye. It was a pivotal moment. She knelt, softly murmuring words I could not hear, brushing the infant's hair back gently. The dog exhaled slowly, eyes still fixed, body tense but compliant. He allowed the mother to make contact, to hold, to comfort, but never relinquished his guardianship. In that delicate balance, I saw a profound lesson. Protection is not about ownership. It is about presence. The German Shepherd had learned that love and vigilance could coexist without dominance, that loyalty could extend to more than one life at a time, and that trust is both given and earned through patience. Over the following nights, the mother began to notice the dog more clearly, though she did not yet speak to me. She would pause at the alley entrance, glance toward the blanket, and then watch as the dog shifted positions, ever alert, ever protective. There was a quiet awe in her stance, a recognition that something extraordinary was unfolding. The dog, aware of her observation, adjusted subtly, demonstrating his restraint and his role without fear or arrogance. It was a silent dialogue, wordless, yet eloquent, a testimony to the intelligence and depth of his character. The baby's responses grew more consistent. Tiny fingers reached more deliberately, brushing along the dog's neck, tugging at the edges of his fur with growing familiarity. The dog allowed these gestures, shifting slightly to accommodate, breathing steady, eyes softening in response. And I, watching, understood the weight of this bond, not merely a bond of protection, but a bond of trust, patience, and recognition. Each night, as I documented their interactions in my notebook, I realized that this silent transformation was as much for me as for them. I was learning to witness without interfering, to observe without disrupting, to understand the quiet power of connection formed through restraint and empathy. Even as the days lengthened and the nights became warmer, the dog maintained his vigilance. His protective instinct did not wane, nor did his awareness of the environment around him. Every movement, every subtle shift of weight, every glance toward the surrounding alleyways spoke of a creature fully engaged in his role, aware of the fragility of life and the responsibility he had chosen. It was a lesson in patience, dedication, and the slow cultivation of trust. By the end of that week, I felt an undeniable shift. The mother's awareness, the infant's recognition, and the dog's vigilance had coalesced into a fragile harmony. It was a quiet acknowledgement that life, even after neglect and abandonment, could form patterns of care and protection. The German Shepherd was no longer merely surviving. He was thriving within a network of trust, slowly weaving himself into the lives of those around him, demonstrating that loyalty, love, and vigilance need not be loud to be profound. The rhythm we had cultivated, dog, infant, mother, observer, was delicate, a fragile balance that existed in the narrow alley and the muted light of early evenings. For weeks, the German Shepherd's vigilance had gone unquestioned. His presence was accepted as part of the quiet ecosystem we had formed, a sentinel in the shadows, a silent guardian whose loyalty and patience defined the very pulse of that small, hidden world. Yet life, as I had long learned, rarely allowed such harmony to exist without testing it. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A new neighbor arrived in the building across the alley, carrying a loud voice and a restless presence. At first, it was nothing more than movement in the periphery, doors opening and closing late at night, footsteps echoing against concrete, the occasional bark from a dog unseen. The German Shepherd stiffened instantly at these intrusions, positioning himself, Between the baby and the potential disturbance, muscles coiled, eyes darting, ears swiveling with acute awareness. He had learned to read subtle cues, and even minor shifts in tone or movement set him on high alert. I noticed the change immediately. Nights that had once been hushed, almost reverent in their quiet rhythm, now carried a tension I could not ignore. The infant, though still unaware of the specifics, began to stir more often, small fingers reaching instinctively toward the dog's body for reassurance. And the mother, exhausted from long days, began to linger less in the alley, hesitant to engage fully with a space that no longer felt completely safe. I could see the faint worry etched across her face, a worry that mirrored my own. One evening, the tension escalated. A group of teenagers passed through the alley, their voices boisterous, their movements careless. They did not see the baby or the dog at first, but their proximity and noise caused immediate alertness. The German Shepherd rose to his feet, low growl rumbling in his throat, ears forward, muscles coiled like steel springs. The infant stirred, fingers gripping the blanket tightly, and the mother's footsteps faltered as she instinctively moved, closer to the child. I watched, frozen in place, as the dog positioned himself fully between them and the approaching group, every movement precise, every posture deliberate. The teenagers laughed, tossing a soda can that clanged against the metal trash bin. The dog's growl deepened, low and resonant, yet he did not move toward them. He merely stood his ground, chest forward, body angled to shield the infant completely. The tension in the alley became almost tactile. I could feel it pressing against my chest, thick and unyielding. The baby, sensing the protective presence beside him, whimpered softly but did not cry. The German Shepherd exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving the potential threat, every instinct honed for prevention rather than confrontation. After what felt like an eternity, the teenagers moved on, unaware of the silent drama they had passed. The dog lowered his head slowly, muscles relaxing in stages, but he did not leave his post. He remained beside the blanket, alert and watchful, exhaling in steady, measured breaths, his eyes scanning the empty alley before allowing himself to settle fully. The infant, reassured by the proximity and warmth of his guardian, snuggled slightly, deeper into the folds of the blanket, and I, witnessing the entire exchange, realized the magnitude of what was unfolding. He had become a being capable of calculated vigilance, tempered by empathy, and dedicated entirely to the fragile life before him. The next day, signs of intrusion were subtler, but no less disturbing. Footprints appeared where none had been before, stray wrappers littered the edge of the alley, and distant voices echoed long after nightfall. The dog moved like a shadow through the mist, alert, sniffing, assessing every sound and scent. The infant responded in kind, reaching instinctively toward the protective body beside him. Even the mother began to take note, pausing at the entrance of the alley, glancing at the dog with a mixture of awe and quiet concern. There was no need for words. The unspoken understanding was already clear. He was here to protect, and any threat, however minor, would meet his watchful presence. Yet even in the tension, there was an undeniable beauty to his vigilance. It was measured, deliberate, never cruel, never aggressive beyond necessity. He had learned to balance the instinct to react with the wisdom of restraint, to stand between danger and innocence without tipping the scales too far in either direction. And in watching him, I understood the extraordinary depth of his character. A creature once defined by neglect and solitude had become the embodiment of loyalty, protection, and quiet courage. As the week progressed, I began to notice a subtle shift in the mother's behavior. She lingered longer at the alley's edge, her gaze fixed on the dog and the infant. She observed the careful positioning, the slight nudges of reassurance, the watchful eyes that never left the child. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to reach out to him, placing a tentative hand on his fur, feeling the heat and solidity of his body. He did not flinch, did not shift abruptly. He merely allowed the contact while maintaining his protective stance. It was a silent negotiation, a mutual recognition that her presence was now part of the environment he was safeguarding. And yet, the underlying threat remained. Footsteps, voices, the occasional distant sound of traffic was a constant reminder that the world beyond the alley was unpredictable, chaotic, and often indifferent to the fragile lives it brushed against. The dog's vigilance never waned. Each night he assessed, calculated, and positioned himself precisely where he needed to be. He had become more than a protector. He had become a force of subtle authority, his presence alone enough to deter, to watch, and to guide. I began to document these behaviors more meticulously, noting the subtle adjustments, the timing of each shift, the minute gestures of communication between dog and child. There was intelligence here, yes, but also empathy, a rare combination that I had never witnessed so clearly. And in observing him, I realized that threats, while real and present, could never undo the bond forming quietly in the shadows. Trust, vigilance, and presence were more powerful than any transient danger. Yet I also understood that the tension would only grow. The city would not pause for their bond, the world outside would remain unpredictable, and the delicate balance we had nurtured could be disrupted at any moment. It was a test, subtle but insistent, of loyalty, courage, and resilience. And the German shepherd, scared and wary though he was, met that test not with aggression or panic, but with quiet determination and unwavering devotion. As fog settled over the alley that night, the infant sleeping soundly beside him, and the mother lingering in the distance with cautious awe, I felt the weight of what had been achieved and the fragility of it. The shadows of threat would not disappear, but neither would the silent guardianship that had grown from necessity, patience, and trust. And in that delicate balance, I recognized a truth I had been waiting for. Even in a world of uncertainty and danger, loyalty, courage, and love could create their own sanctuary, however hidden, however temporary, and however quiet. The tension in the alley did not dissipate. It deepened, becoming almost tangible in the damp air, a quiet pressure pressing against everything within its narrow confines. Nights that had once been merely tense now carried an edge of anticipation, as if the shadows themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see how the fragile bond would endure. The German shepherd moved with precision. Each shift, each glance, each subtle repositioning a calculated act of protection. His body had become a living barrier between the infant and the uncertain world beyond. The infant had grown accustomed to the presence beside him, small fingers reaching out instinctively, brushing along the coarse fur in moments of comfort. The child's breath was now a part of the rhythm of the alley, the tiny exhalations a signal, a rhythm the dog had learned to follow with extraordinary attentiveness. Yet the world beyond the walls remained indifferent, unpredictable, and occasionally intrusive. The faint echo of footsteps, the distant hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the sudden clatter of debris, all were interpreted by him as potential threats, and his responses, though measured, were immediate. The mother had begun to linger longer, closer, to the infant, her gaze hesitant yet observant. She had learned to read his subtle movements, the tilt of an ear, the slight tightening of a shoulder, the low exhalation signaling that danger had passed. There was a silent communication between them, wordless yet eloquent, a mutual acknowledgement of roles and responsibilities. And still, the alley remained a threshold, a boundary between safety and uncertainty. One night, that boundary was tested. The fog was thick, the world muted to grey, and the alley seemed smaller, more constricted. A man appeared at the entrance, unfamiliar, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who assumed he belonged wherever he chose. He paused at the mouth of the alley, scanning, and the German shepherd stiffened instantly. The infant stirred, sensing the tension, and the mother's hand hovered protectively over the child. The dog's body tensed, a coiled presence, yet his gaze was not merely reactive. It was assessing, calculating, measuring the potential threat against his responsibility. The man stepped closer, deliberate, unaware of the silent guardian within. The dog exhaled slowly, muscles flexing beneath his fur, positioning himself fully between the intruder and the infant. There was no growl, no bark, only a steady, unyielding presence. The tension became almost unbearable, a quiet struggle between authority and defiance. The man stopped, sensing the weight of his scrutiny, and the subtle shift in posture that spoke of capability and resolve. For a moment, It seemed as if the alley itself held its breath, suspended between confrontation and retreat. Slowly, the man's posture softened, awareness dawning that he was not in control here. Without a word, without a gesture beyond caution, he retreated. The dog did not relax immediately. He remained vigilant, ensuring the threat had truly passed. The infant's breathing returned to a rhythmic pattern, small fingers curling into the folds of the blanket, seeking warmth and safety. The mother's relief was quiet, almost imperceptible, a whispered acknowledgement that the presence beside her child was formidable yet restrained, loyal yet wise. Afterward, the alley returned to its muted calm, but the event had left an indelible impression. The German shepherd's vigilance had not wavered. His body, poised and ready, had demonstrated both courage and intelligence. It was no longer a simple act of guarding. It was an assertion of purpose, a declaration that trust could be earned and that boundaries would be maintained with precision. The infant, unaware of the danger, responded only through instinct, curling closer, sensing the solidity of the presence beside him, and the mother, finally able to step fully into the space without fear, allowed herself to touch him, brushing a hand along the coarse fur, a gesture of gratitude, awe, and acknowledgement. In the following nights, I noticed a subtle shift in the German shepherd's behavior. He began to anticipate potential disturbances before they materialized. His posture, once reactive, became proactive, adjusting to the environment with subtle, preemptive movements. He would reposition the blanket, ensuring warmth and protection. He would nudge the infant gently when restless, aligning body and breath to provide comfort. It was no longer merely about defense, it had evolved into a holistic guardianship, integrating protection, care, and emotional presence. The mother, too, became more engaged, her confidence growing with each passing night. She would linger closer, observing the interplay, allowing the dog to dictate the pace and extent of interaction. There was a mutual respect forming, silent but profound, a recognition that this was not merely a domestic relationship, but a coalescence of instinct, trust, and choice. Every gesture was deliberate. Every glance, every breath carried meaning. The infant's responses became more consistent, the small fingers brushing fur, the faint exhalations syncing with the dog's measured breaths, an unspoken dialogue of reassurance and comfort. And yet, the tension of the outside world remained. Each night brought potential intrusions, shadows moving beyond the alley, the distant hum of vehicles, the occasional passer-by whose footsteps echoed unnervingly. The dog's vigilance never waned, his body a constant line of defense and care. There was a lesson in every movement, a story in every gesture, the courage to stand, the wisdom to wait, the patience to endure, and I, silently observing, recorded all the subtle transformations, the quiet negotiations, the slow evolution of trust and loyalty in the most unlikely of places. In one particularly still night, as fog clung to the brick walls and the city hummed faintly beyond, the mother finally spoke not to the dog, not to me, but aloud to herself, a soft acknowledgement of gratitude and awe. "You're remarkable," she whispered, and the dog, though not understanding the words, seemed to recognize the intent, exhaling slowly, muscles relaxing only slightly. The infant remained nestled against him, breathing even, small fingers curled into fur, and I realized that what we were witnessing was more than protection. It was the slow emergence of a family, unconventional and fragile, yet rooted in trust, loyalty, and quiet courage. As the alley returned to darkness, the baby sleeping soundly, and the mother lingering in cautious relief, I understood that the edge of choice had been crossed. The threat had been met not with aggression, but with intelligence and restraint, not with panic, but with courage and vigilance. And in that quiet victory, a subtle transformation was cemented. The German shepherd had moved beyond mere survival, beyond instinct, into the realm of guardianship, empathy, and trust, a silent, unspoken hero whose presence had reshaped the world of two lives, one fragile and one scarred. The nights in the alley had grown longer, heavier with the weight of vigilance and expectation. The German shepherd had become more than a protector. He had become the axis around which the fragile world of infant, mother, and observer revolved. Every shift, every measured breath, every subtle adjustment of body or gaze spoke of purpose honed by hardship, guided by instinct, and tempered by empathy. And yet, despite this careful equilibrium, the world beyond our secluded sanctuary was pressing closer, demanding a reckoning that none of us could evade. It began quietly, as most significant changes do, with the faint hum of distant voices and the shuffle of feet along the alleyway. I noticed the tension in the dog's stance immediately. Muscles coiled, ears angled sharply, eyes scanning for sources of disturbance. He had become attuned not only to the infant's needs, but to the subtle shifts of the environment, predicting danger with uncanny precision. The baby, sensing the change, shifted slightly, tiny fingers curling instinctively into the dog's coarse fur. And the mother, ever cautious now, lingered close, her gaze fixed on the shadowed form of the guardian, whose presence had become essential to her child's safety. But that night, the subtle disturbances coalesced into a more tangible threat. A man, unfamiliar and imposing, approached the alley with deliberate intent. He carried a clipboard, moving with a formality that suggested authority, yet his presence carried an unspoken tension, a reminder that the world outside did not yield easily to fragile bonds formed in secret. The dog rose instantly, body low but taut, the shadow of muscles rippling beneath damp fur. The infant stirred, sensing the alertness, and the mother's grip tightened on the blanket. Every breath seemed to synchronize, theirs, his, mine, the hay. Rhythm of fear and protection intertwined like threads in an invisible tapestry. The man's voice carried softly but clearly, calling out, "Is anyone here? I'm with animal control." The words, though calm, struck through the muted night, reverberating against walls that had grown accustomed only to silence. The dog's head lifted, ears forward, nostrils flaring as he assessed the situation. This was no ordinary passerby. This was a challenge, a force with authority and consequence, a real-world threat that demanded more than instinct. It demanded judgment. He did not growl, did not lunge. Instead, he positioned himself fully between the infant and the approaching man, body rigid, eyes unwavering, every sinew ready to act. The mother stepped forward cautiously, soft voice trembling slightly as she said, "Please, he's harmless. He protects my child." The dog's gaze flicked between her and the man, acknowledging her words without moving from his protective stance. There was a moment of stillness, a suspended tension that seemed to stretch indefinitely, as though the alley itself were holding its breath. The man's eyes scanned the infant, the mother, and the German shepherd, assessing, calculating. He lowered his clipboard slightly, but the authority in his posture remained. I realized then that this was a crossroads, not just for the dog, not just for the infant, but for all of us. The quiet equilibrium we had cultivated would be tested by forces beyond the alley walls, by rules and procedures that acknowledged neither instinct nor devotion. The dog's choice, whether to maintain his stance, to retreat, or to assert authority through presence alone, was emblematic of the larger struggle. Survival balanced with trust, protection balanced with understanding. The infant's small fingers reached instinctively toward the dog, curling into his fur. The gesture, simple yet profound, seemed to communicate more than words ever could. The dog exhaled slowly, muscles relaxing just enough to signal calm without relinquishing his post. His gaze remained fixed on the man, unwavering, silent, an unspoken declaration. "This is my responsibility, and I will not falter." The man hesitated, observing, sensing the depth of loyalty and intelligence in the dog's stance. Slowly, carefully, he spoke again, quieter this time, almost reverently. "I see. He's protective. He's aware." There was no derision, no attempt to command, only acknowledgement. The dog's ears flicked, a subtle movement, and he remained steadfast, allowing recognition without compromise. The mother exhaled softly, relief mingling with awe, as the infant's breathing returned to its steady rhythm, small chest rising and falling against the warmth beside him. I understood then that the alley had become a crucible, forging not only trust but recognition. The dog's quiet courage, his unwavering presence, and his instinctual empathy had reshaped the perceptions of everyone present. Authority could be acknowledged without challenge, rules could coexist with instinct, and loyalty could assert itself without violence. The human observer, the mother, and even the figure representing external control were witnesses to the extraordinary nature of this guardianship, quiet, patient, and profound. After a long pause, the man stepped back, clipboard in hand, nodding slowly. "I'll leave you be for now, he's earned it." The words, though official in tone, carried weight far beyond their surface meaning. The dog exhaled, muscles loosening slightly, yet remained in position, attentive still, a sentinel not yet ready to fully relax. The infant curled closer, sensing the calm return, while the mother's hand stroked his fur gently, reinforcing the bond they shared. That night, as the fog thickened and the alley receded into shadows, I reflected on what had transpired. The dog had faced authority, a tangible challenge to his guardianship, and had responded with wisdom, restraint, and unwavering loyalty. The infant, entirely unaware of the intricacies of the encounter, had been shielded without even knowing danger existed. The mother had witnessed a being transformed by devotion, learning to respect boundaries while asserting care. And I, chronicling each subtle gesture, each measured breath, each quiet act of courage, recognized that redemption had taken a form far more profound than heroics or grand gestures. It was a redemption built from patience, vigilance, and empathy, a slow evolution of trust into protective love. The German Shepherd had been given a second chance, not through human intervention alone, but through the bonds he had forged quietly in the shadows, through the unwavering presence he offered, and through the deep instinctual understanding that life, though fragile, demanded guardianship and devotion. As the infant slept, undisturbed and safe, and the mother lingered close with eyes reflecting both awe and gratitude, the German Shepherd exhaled slowly, settling once more beside the blanket. The fog swirled around them, muting the world beyond, and I realized that the crossroads we had faced was not a singular moment but a threshold, a quiet assertion that loyalty, courage, and patient guardianship could create sanctuaries even in the most unpredictable of worlds. The transformation was complete in its subtlety, profound in its impact, and irreversible in its depth. The days that followed were steeped in a calm that felt almost sacred, yet the memory of the previous night lingered in every shadow, every whisper of wind through the alley. The German Shepherd, ever vigilant, moved with the same careful precision as before, yet there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, an unspoken acknowledgement that the world had recognized his guardianship, that his patience and loyalty had earned respect beyond instinct alone. The infant slept soundly beside him, small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that had become both anchor and signal, and the mother lingered closer, her hand brushing gently across the coarse fur that had become a source of quiet reassurance. I observed them from the edge, notebook in hand, but it felt unnecessary to document every movement. This was no longer mere observation. It was witnessing a family forming in the most unconventional of ways. The German Shepherd had become the axis of this fragile equilibrium, and every decision he made carried weight far beyond his own survival. His presence had shaped the alley into a sanctuary, a space of quiet trust that extended outward to anyone who approached with respect rather than malice. Yet life, even when gently unfolding, carries the inevitability of choice. The mother, aware now of the dog's profound influence, began to wrestle with the practicalities of the outside world. The need for stability, the rules of city ordinances, the intrusion of authority that might one day return. Her glances toward him were filled with deliberation, a soft tension that mirrored the silent negotiation playing out in every furrow of his brow, every tilt of his ear. There was an understanding forming, not through words, but through shared presence. The time had come to make a choice that would determine not only his future, but the stability of the infant's life. One evening, as the fog rolled low and muted the edges of the city, she approached, tentative, voice soft and uncertain. "I don't know if I can do this alone," she whispered, her eyes meeting his, then falling to the infant nestled safely against him. The German Shepherd, as if sensing the gravity of her words, shifted slightly, exhaling slowly, muscles relaxing but posture remaining protective. There was no fear in his gaze, only the quiet, steady acknowledgement that he understood the weight of responsibility that had been placed upon them all. The choice became a silent dialogue, carried not in conversation, but in gesture. The mother knelt, fingers brushing the dog's fur, tracing the lines of muscle and scar with reverence. She lingered, observing his eyes, the measured exhalation, the subtle shifts that indicated awareness and trust. It was in these moments, quiet and unhurried, that the enormity of the decision revealed itself. To embrace the bond fully, to claim guardianship and nurture trust, or to retreat into the safety of convention, leaving behind the fragile world they had built together. The German shepherd, sensing the internal struggle, responded not with words but with presence. He leaned slightly into her hand, exhaling steadily, adjusting the infant's blanket with a nudge of his snout. Every movement was deliberate, a silent communication of trust, of readiness to continue the bond, of willingness to meet the challenges of the outside world with measured courage. There was no coercion, no demand, only the quiet assertion that the choice to stay, to protect, and to love was mutual, that guardianship was both gift and responsibility, freely given and freely received. As the night deepened, the fog thickened, and the alley receded into shadow, the mother made her decision. With trembling hands, she gathered the infant into her arms, careful not to disturb the fragile rhythm that had been established. She looked down at the dog, eyes filled with gratitude and awe, and whispered words that he may not have understood, yet felt in the weight of intention. "Will you stay with us?" There was no pause, no hesitation, only the subtle, affirmative shift of his body, the steady exhalation that signaled acceptance. He remained close, adjusting his position to provide warmth, security, and reassurance, a sentinel whose loyalty had been tested and proven in silence. In the following days, the practicalities began to align with the emotional realities. The mother arranged for vaccinations, vet checkups, and official registration, ensuring that his presence could be sustained within the boundaries of the city's regulations. Yet even in the bureaucracy, the essence of their bond remained untouchable. He was more than a pet, more than a guardian. He was a being whose loyalty and patience had reshaped the lives of those around him, whose silent courage had turned an alley into a sanctuary, whose quiet presence had forged a family. The infant, growing stronger each day, responded to his protector with consistent gestures, tiny hands reaching, soft exhalations syncing with his steady breathing, small smiles that seemed to communicate recognition and gratitude. The mother, once hesitant and fearful of the unknown, now lingered with confidence, observing and participating in the quiet dialogue between child and dog, and I, witnessing the transformation, felt the weight of what had been achieved, a fragile ecosystem of trust, patience, and love that had emerged from hardship, neglect, and uncertainty. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, painting the alley in muted golden shadow, the German shepherd lay beside the infant, his body relaxed yet ready, eyes scanning with quiet assurance. The mother rested nearby, hand tracing the curve of his back, her expression a mixture of reverence, awe, and relief. The air carried the faint scent of rain, the soft murmur of distant traffic, and the subtle, steady rhythm of life resuming its fragile order. There was no fanfare, no dramatic gesture, only the profound simplicity of presence, trust, and choice. It was in these quiet moments that the true depth of redemption became clear. The dog had been given a chance not merely to survive, but to shape a world through loyalty, courage, and empathy. The mother had chosen to embrace the bond, to honor the guardianship, to integrate instinct and devotion into the practicalities of life. And the infant, entirely unaware of the magnitude of the forces shaping his world, thrived within the warmth and security of their shared existence. By the end of that week, the alley no longer felt like a place of shadows and tension, but a sanctuary of patience, trust, and quiet love. The German shepherd's transformation was complete in its subtlety, profound in its impact, and irreversible in its depth. He had crossed the threshold from survival to guardianship, from instinct to empathy, from isolation to family. And as the infant slept, secure and breathing evenly, and the mother lingered close, the world beyond the alley felt less threatening, less indifferent, shaped instead by the quiet courage and loyalty of one extraordinary dog. The alley, once shrouded in fog, tension, and the unspoken threats of a city that seemed indifferent to small lives, had transformed into a haven. It was subtle, quiet, almost imperceptible to anyone who did not linger, watch, and breathe in the rhythm of the space. The German shepherd lay beside the infant. Now more than a protector, he was a guardian, a silent teacher, and a living testament to the power of patience, loyalty, and love. Every breath, every subtle movement, carried a narrative of trust and devotion that words could never fully capture. Evening settled in slow, muted waves. The fading sunlight spilled across the alley's bricks in streaks of amber and shadow, illuminating the soft rise and fall of the infant's chest. His tiny fingers twitched against the dog's fur, exploring, discovering, connecting. The German shepherd shifted gently, nudging the child closer with a careful press of his snout, ensuring warmth and safety. He had learned the weight of responsibility, the gravity of guardianship, and now he moved with an elegance that spoke not of instinct alone but of awareness, empathy, and enduring devotion. The mother remained close, kneeling silently, observing the interplay between her child and the dog. Her fingers traced the curve of his back, soft and reverent. There was no need for words. They had become unnecessary in the presence of shared understanding. She had witnessed his courage in the face of uncertainty, his unwavering patience, his intelligence tempered by restraint. And now, in these quiet moments, she was learning the subtle poetry of trust, the way it could be earned, in silence, maintained through devotion, and rewarded with the profound simplicity of connection. I sat a short distance away, notebook closed, recognizing that observation had shifted into something far deeper: reverence. The German shepherd had transcended the role of a mere animal in need. He had become a teacher, shaping the emotional contours of the lives around him through quiet, consistent guardianship. The infant responded instinctively, reaching, curling, exhaling in the rhythm of a bond that had been forged in patience, tested in vigilance, and strengthened through trust. Each moment was a lesson in the power of subtlety, in the depth of quiet courage, in the invisible threads that connect lives in the most profound ways. Night descended gradually, wrapping the alley in muted shadows and soft breezes. The distant hum of the city was faint, almost swallowed by the enveloping calm. The mother whispered a few words to the infant, soft and low, words of comfort, gratitude, and quiet reassurance. The German shepherd remained poised, muscles relaxed but alert, eyes scanning the perimeter, even as his body lay near the child. His presence was a living boundary, a line drawn between the fragility of innocence and the unpredictability of the world beyond. And yet, it was not fear that guided him. It was understanding, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to protect without domination. There was a moment, fleeting and almost imperceptible, when the infant reached upward with both hands, resting them against the dog's face. The gesture was pure, instinctual, a touch that spoke of recognition, trust, and the deep-seated awareness that this being, this silent sentinel, was integral to his world. The dog exhaled, nuzzling the child gently, allowing warmth, connection, and reassurance to flow without interruption. The mother's eyes glistened, reflecting both relief and awe, as the gravity of what had been achieved settled into a soft, enduring rhythm. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and distant rain. I could hear the soft rustle of leaves, the distant echo of life continuing beyond the alley's walls, yet the space here was insulated, sacred in its quietude. The German shepherd shifted slightly, repositioning the blanket over the infant, tucking him gently with careful precision. It was a small gesture, almost invisible to an unobservant eye, yet it carried monumental significance, the assertion of guardianship, the offering of comfort, the silent promise that this fragile life would be tended to, protected, and cherished. The mother leaned back slightly, taking a slow breath, exhaling into the muted night. "We're okay," she whispered, not as a statement of fact, but as an acknowledgement of the journey, the struggle, and the delicate trust that had been nurtured into permanence. The dog lifted his head, ears flicking softly, acknowledging her presence with a tilt that was both gentle and resolute. There was a quiet understanding between them. The bond formed here was not contingent on circumstance, but on choice, patience, and unwavering loyalty. I watched almost reverently as the infant's breathing deepened, his body settling fully against the warmth of the dog. The scene was profoundly ordinary and yet extraordinarily moving, a testament to the quiet power of guardianship, of patience, of love forged in silence and tested in vigilance. The fog, now almost completely settled, swirled gently at the edges of the alley, softening lines, muting shadows, and enclosing this fragile sanctuary in a protective veil. Hours passed with deliberate slowness, unmarked by urgency or drama. The German shepherd remained steadfast, a living anchor until finally, the infant's small exhalations deepened into sleep, chest rising and falling in even rhythmic harmony. The mother rested her hand lightly on the dog's back, lingering, tracing a soft path of acknowledgement and reverence. The night was quiet, unbroken except for the faint whispers of the city, beyond a world that could be indifferent, chaotic, or threatening, yet held at bay by the vigilance and love of one extraordinary being. And then, as if the alley itself exhaled in relief, the German shepherd shifted once more, curling beside the child in a final act of closeness, a soft press of body and fur that sealed the bond forged through months of hardship, vigilance, and quiet courage. It was a gesture without words, a promise without sound, and a closure that felt like a whisper carried on the night air. The mother's eyes closed softly, her lips pressing a faint, grateful smile, and I, witnessing the scene, understood the magnitude of what had been achieved. A fragile, unconventional family had been formed, a bond tested by the world and strengthened through trust, patience, and love. As the first hints of dawn began to trace the edges of the rooftops, the infant still asleep, the mother resting nearby, and the German shepherd breathing steadily beside them, the alley held a profound stillness. There was no need for ceremony, no need for words or fanfare. The story, carried through shadows, fog, and uncertainty, had found its quiet resolution. The child was safe, the dog fulfilled his guardianship, and the mother was present in awe and gratitude. And in that silence, in the slow, deliberate rhythm of breath and warmth, the story concluded as it had begun, with quiet presence, trust earned, and love whispered into the world.